Are we go? Okay, well that's the dissertation title, although I'm not going to try to make it make too much sense in the next 5 minutes. Basically, the dissertation is going to be a Benjaminian riff on the American Renaissance that is in return a Melvillian riff on Benjamin. So, my authors in their daguerreotypic selves, in case you're wondering if I'm doing an unconventional lineup, and no, it is. I plan on becoming a dead white man, so I want to understand something. So what I'm going to do, for the sake of accessibility, is talk a little bit about the use of the visual arts in Herman Melville's Pierre, perhaps the least popular and least accessible novel of the 19th century. If you haven't read it, you haven't really, then this is going to be Melville's attempt at a sentimental Gothic novel, wherein the sort of poverty and kind of exclusion around the American sort of pseudo-aristocracy will appear as, Gothic specters and supernatural incursions, really just the full. And this will be framed around the young hero discovers, to his shock, that he has a long-lost half-sister named Isabel, who is a tempestuous Gothic stereotype. At which point, he decides that to preserve his sainted father's image, he has to pretend to marry her and throw over Lucy, his fiancée. And here, haunted by Isabel's strange face, which is so far a specter, he is planning an evening with his fiancée over books. So we have Dearest Lucy. Well, 'twill be a pretty time we'll have this evening. There's the book of Flemish Prince, that first we must look over. Then second is Flaxman's Homer. Clear-cut outlines, yet full of unadorned barbaric nobleness. And even though it's supposedly a contemporary novel set in the 1850s when it was written, it sounds like that. And John Flaxman here is a 19th century British sculptor best known for his illustrations of Homer, Aeschylus, and Dante, pictured here. And if you'll notice, these would have been circulated as engravings by Tommaso Paroli and others, and Melville is familiar with them and is going to reference them in this text. And you'll notice that these outlines aren't full of anything. They're bare form, two-dimensional, with figures set into depth in layers as opposed to through the receding lines of point perspective. So if they're full of if they're full of barbaric nobleness, it's by virtue of being unadorned, by being empty, so that they get to be full of this narrative immediacy by being full of nothing else. And then we move farther and farther towards phantasmagoria. We have our realistic Flemish prince. We have the clear-cut barbaric nobleness of Homer, and then we're not going to read Dante. Dante is too creepy, he's too Gothic. If you're trying to spend a nice domestic time with your, sentimental blonde cliche of a girlfriend, you're not going to read Dante. And here is going to be one of Flaxman's prints from the Dante, one of the ones they're not going to be reading, which is exactly the scene they're avoiding. It's, Paolo and Francesca over Lancelot. And here, he's talking about the face of Isabel, the sort of darker woman. Methinks now the face, minds me a little of pensive sweet Francesca's face, or rather, as it had been Francesca's daughter's face, wafted on the sad dark wind toward observant Virgil and the blistering Florentine. It still sounds like that. These are relatively normal passages for Pierre, and you'll notice that we have him avoiding the scene of reading, partly to avoid the association of that face. And if you look at her face here, it is this sliver in profile. It is barely represented, nothing like a portrait. And if it has that sweet, pensive expression, it's because her gaze is objectless. It's not exactly at the book. It's not exactly at the figure. And because there's this sort of inclined neck. And then here is the only other print of Paolo and Francesca in Flaxman's Dante. And you'll notice here we get even less of a face, which is going to be problematic for the way this passage sets up the relationship between the sort of visual and verbal. So here we have Francesca's mournful face is now ideal to me. Flaxman might evoke it wholly, make it present in lines of misery, bewitching power. And how is he going to do that? He's barely shown us this girl, and you'll have a lot of readings of this passage in the novel that say, okay, this is about how verbal poetry makes things ideal and flexible to the mind, where visual representation, God art historians, just sucks the fun out of everything. And it spatializes and concretizes and does all sorts of other nefarious things, which is ridiculous because we don't get that effect at all from these. Given the way that passage is set up, it's not clear whether the lines of misery are Flaxman's outlines or in fact Dante's original lines of verse. It's not clear whether evocation is the same thing as representation, and this means that a lot of our received cliches about the visual in literature have to be subordinated to particulars of technique. And you'll notice here, Pierre's final curse, which I won't dramatically render, refers to reading and not to seeing. And we have to think, I presume, that if he had not read Dante, these experiences concentrated in the illustration would not have their peculiar force. Which is to say that this is a dissertation that is about taking this sort of technical level of the visual out. Sorry.